And then he started to think of some of the other things that he started to consider mistakes. Well, this is going on, the press of time comes along, and Secretary Kellogg says, look, I know you're working on this, I really need this. So in one afternoon, J. Reuben Clark sat down and wrote the 17-page memorandum. One afternoon. And that's really the heart and soul. You have this appendix, but he wrote it in one afternoon. And the key points were, as he gets done with that, is that he says the Roosevelt corollary was an aberration. The Monroe Doctrine really was designed to simply deal with, in his language again, the relationship between the United States and Europe, and really doesn't say anything about what ought to be the rules between the United States and Latin America. And for that, non-intervention seems the appropriate thing, unless we ourselves are attacked or have some national interest. And he said, so far as Latin America is concerned, the doctrine is not an instrument of violence and oppression, which is how it had been used. Notice the words he uses, violence and oppression, some of these decisions he's been involved in, but an effective guarantee of their freedom, independence, and territorial integrity against the imperialistic designs of Europe. Now, that's all, I suppose, I hope somewhat interesting to sort of figure out what the Clark Memorandum is, but that's not the point I want to make. There's three lessons from this particular memorandum. Number one, comes from the fact that he wrote this memorandum in one afternoon. That's the rewards that come from research, if you will, and preparation, but also from a lifetime of learning and preparation. He was familiar with these documents. And he was used to lining up everything in a very systematic way. Those of you who have ever read his work called Our Lord of the Gospels, in which he just sort of lines up the Gospels, harmonizes them together, and that's a much more difficult task than you would think. That's how he thought. That allowed him, when he goes through things in a very systematic way, to then, at a moment's notice, literally almost in this case, to sort of say, okay, let me now capture this all down in a 17-page memorandum written without word processor, just to remind us as we do this, in one afternoon. Frank Fox in the DVD talks about him, he's working till the cows have gone home, Frank Fox says, looking for the last case, the last citation, and he said he was so well fitted for this. This was something that J. Reuben Clark really resonated. He wanted to thoroughly understand everything. One of the other things you see in the DVD is there's the scene where there's snow falling, and there's a recording of an entry, one entry from his father's diary, saying at the end of it, Elmer and Edwin did not go to school, but Reuben said he would rather miss a meal than a day of school. That's one of three entries in a row that are in Reuben Clark's journal about his son. I want to read all three of them, because I think you get a better picture for this. Monday, a very stormy morning, snowing and the wind blowing from north, snow drifting. We advised the children not to go to school. Reuben thought he could attend it, and so went. Edwin and Elmer remained at home. Tuesday, a bitter cold morning. I think we are now having the coldest weather that I have ever experienced in the month of February. The boys started to school this morning, but it was so cold and stormy that we called them back. Edwin and Elmer remained at home. Reuben had got out of hearing. One wonders whether he had got out of hearing. Wednesday, the weather was extremely cold last night and this morning. We thought it was too cold to send Edwin and Elmer to school today, and then what you see in the DVD. But Reuben would rather miss his meals than miss a day of school. This was not an aberration. His father was going, this is cold. We're telling the kids, stay home. We're calling them back. And Reuben, I think his father knew too. Reuben had got out of hearing. I mean, come on. Reuben loved to learn. Now, one of the things I've wondered about is, do we learn to love to learn, or are we sort of born with that? I think, as with many gifts, some people have that gift to begin with. But I'm convinced, as with all gifts, that it's possible for us to develop that. And the rewards of that are the ability to write a document in one afternoon that really has a major impact on foreign policy in the United States. Second lesson that follows from that, you never know when your work will become important. This was not something on anyone's radar screen. It was a modest assignment, testimony for the Senate hearing. Even afterward, there was some splash in the newspapers about this because the Kellogg-Briand Treaty was such a big thing. But there wasn't much. It was not published. He wrote this in 1928. It was not published until 1930. Even then, at the time, it was not published as official policy. But it then became, in fact, J. Reuben Clark himself wrote, it will probably all soon be forgotten, and the press generally will recur to the imperialistic conception and misinterpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. And yet, for the world, the thing that J. Reuben Clark Jr. is most noted for, those who study history, is the Clark Memorandum. It became the precursor for really a shift in foreign policy for the United States to stop intervening so much in Latin American affairs. Led to the good neighbor policy and everything else. There's still discussion, as of at least 20 years ago, when I looked at some things, in which you find discussion about how important the Clark Memorandum was, and was it that changed it, was it something else? But it is a very well-known document among historians. It's the thing he's known for. If you want to know if he's known for it, if you go on Wikipedia, source of all information, there is an entry for the Clark Memorandum explaining this. I mean, this is really, as I say, what he's known for. But it is not something that he set out to do for that. He was just doing the day-to-day work, as he says in the DVD, and all of a sudden he has a document that changes things. Number third is the humility and wisdom to learn from life's experiences. As I said, he had been involved in many decisions to intervene in not only Mexico and Nicaragua. One author said J. Reuben Clark knew all about intervention. He and Huntington Wilson had masterminded the Nicaraguan interventions of 1910 and 1912 largely by themselves. He knew all about intervention, and then the biographer adds, and what he knew changed him. He had learned. He'd been intimately involved in Mexico, really setting the policy for Mexico as the solicitor in 1910 through 1913. He had never been to Mexico until 1927. When he went to Mexico, this was with Dwight Morrow that he went to Mexico with, and he entered and recorded his feelings about after having been there and seen the Mexican people. I want to share from you what President Clark said after that period of time. This was just before he wrote the Clark Memorandum. I had a definite strong prejudice against Mexico and the revolutionary regime in control. I thought they were a group of adventurers, dictators, thoroughly lawless, really despots. When I got to Mexico, I began my first investigation. As I went forward in my work, I found it necessary to reapprise my views and modify my prejudices. By this time, he is, I'm trying to think how old he would be, 59 years old. I recall that one day as I reflected, I said to myself almost orally, well, you have thought you were pretty smart in your appraisals of the Mexican government and its activities in this revolution. After a good deal of thought, I concluded that I could not have worked out the revolutionary purpose with less bloodshed, less hardship to the people, less injury to the great landed class than had the revolutionary leaders of the Mexican Revolution. The humility to recognize and say, I can learn from experiences. J. Reuben Clark, I think those of you who know his views on intervention, sort of was not an interventionist at the end of his career, but that's how he started out. And he was able to learn from those kinds of experiences and go along. Second event, a lesser-known memorandum, and that deals with his calling as a member of the First Presidency. Again, it's described, the circumstances are described well in the DVD that if you haven't seen, this sounds like a commercial, and it is, you ought to see it. December 11th, 1931, President Charles Nibley, a counselor in the First Presidency, passed away, and is described in the DVD. At the funeral of President Nibley, President Grant turned to President Ivins, the other counselor, and said, I know who we're going to get. We'll get Clark, the ambassador to Mexico. The response was, I can't remember if this is in the DVD, President Ivins says, we can't afford him. He's a $100,000 a year man. So they send a letter, and as described by Frank Fox in the DVD, this was not a name on anyone's list. President Clark was not a general authority. I think people know that. He had never been a bishop. He'd never been a stake president. I am not sure. I can't find this out. Someone may know this. I'm not sure he was a high priest. He'd been ordained to 70, but he was not one of them, as we have speculation, from time to time. He was not a name on people's list. And then the DVD talks about the letter that President Clark wrote in response to the calling, which I'll talk about in a second. But now this is sort of the rest of the story. First, I want to give you a bit of a background. At the end of the book, The Public Years by Frank Fox, it's the last chapter, sort of. It's before the epilogue. It's the last chapter of the book, but then there's an epilogue that describes a few other things that tries to tie things together. The last chapter, the last scene of the chapter, finishing the public years, it describes an evening in Mexico, well before this letter had arrived. And it comes from an interview with the Clark children, describing this scene and what it meant to President Clark. And he says they were getting ready for an event. People were preparing, the servants were bustling, searching through, activity was going on, and Reuben had his top hat on, and he's sort of fumbling with his last cufflink, and he looks over and he sees Louisine, his wife. And he says, let's see if I can get through this. It says, she was arranging some lilies on the piano, easily at the moment the most beautiful woman on earth. This, Reuben told himself, was it. For this he had slaved and sacrificed his entire life. For this he had gone to the Grantsville 8th grade over and over again. And then to university, and then to the Columbia Law School, and then to the State Department. This was the dream that lay behind those endless pilgrimages back and forth across the continent, that had taken him in and out of public service, in and out of private practice. Here was the imposing mansion. Here was the well-stocked library with its crackling hearth. Here was the man of account, and here were the people coming to him. And here, vastly more important than all these, was the woman whose sacrifice, whose gallantry, whose quiet self-abnegation had made it all possible. I won't take the time here, but this was not easy for Louisine. She loved Reuben. She did not love the East. She marked days off the calendar when he was in New York, as someone said, like a prisoner marking off the time. And yet she sacrificed. And so President Clark in this scene is sort of saying, this is it, we finally have everything, and she's happy, and I'm happy, and this is what we really wanted. In fact, the closing lines of chapter said, it was at this point in his life that J. Reuben Clark Jr. knew that he had found success. Again, by this time, he's 59 years old. And, you think at that stage, you say, this is it. It's in that context that a letter arrives on Christmas Eve, 1931. The letter, as recorded, is obtained by his daughter Louise. Their children are there visiting. They're now all grown, but they're all there. All of them are there for Christmas. She gets the letter and says to her father, here's a letter from President Grant. He probably is calling you as a counselor in the first presidency. Everyone laughed, the children said. In retrospect, they said everyone laughed except Dad. He took the envelope and put it in his pocket, didn't say anything. Later in the evening, this was Christmas Eve, later in the evening he went into his study. He recorded later he had had a premonition. He knew what was in the letter. That's why he was not laughing. That evening he sat down and he wrote. What we see in the DVD is the second letter that he wrote. That evening on Christmas Eve, he wrote what he entitled Memorandum of Explanation. And in it, what he says is, I am honored that you would think of me in this situation. But I want to tell you my situation. I am here serving the President of the United States. These are delicate times. We're in the midst of negotiations. I really don't think I could leave right now without causing great embarrassment to me, to the church, to President Hoover, who would be disappointed at this. It would be very difficult. And he closes this, if I can find the right page here, saying this. Listen to the diplomatic language. You brethren must have an enormous amount of work and may be in need of help, so much so that you will not care to postpone filling the vacancy for an indefinite time. In that event, I can conceive that if you think it best not to give opportunity for irritation to President Hoover and Secretary Stimson, through my leaving before they desire it, you may wish, instead of waiting for me, to fill the vacancy by appointing someone else. If you take this view, I hope you will feel entirely free to act. Now, the diplomacy is there. He had not turned them down. It was a memorandum of explanation. He filed that away in his drawer, went back, and told no one, including his wife and children. Now, they remembered after the fact. Who knows how these memories get put in order. They said that was the gloomiest Christmas we've ever had. It was clearly something was going on with that. We had no idea what it was. They really didn't think. I mean, they really thought it was a joke when Louis said he may be a counselor in the first presidency. 3 days later, by that time he had told Louisine. 3 days later, he went back to his office and wrote another letter. And it's that letter that is quoted in the DVD. This is the one that says, I have never aspired to church office. Its honor and dignity I